Hey everybody, welcome to another episode featuring the restoration project here of the MS290 Stihl chainsaw. I want to go over some viewers' comments on the last episode and talk a little bit about my plan going forward here. Hopefully tomorrow I'll be able to get out there and it's actually in the evening now, so I can't do it now, but hopefully I'll be able to get out there tomorrow and attempt to reset that carburetor and get this thing running correctly. But I'm going to do a couple of things tonight to get this thing ready to go, and I just want to talk about some of the suggestions, and there was actually quite a few good ones here. So this is for those of you who just stumbled upon this video and haven't seen it yet. Hey, somebody gave this a thumbs down. Part 6. So this will be part 7. Anyways, basically I was very frustrated and having trouble. Not going to read all of these comments. Just rereading some of these again and still getting a laugh. Mark V says, sure sounds like a fuel issue. And he says he could feel my frustration. Scott H says on his, the fuel line wanted to kink. He made sure that it was all the way up to the bend in the carb nipple. Still over time it kinked, and then he cut a 1/4 inch off the end and no more problems. The aftermarket one was worse, as the thick flat section at the end was longer, and that I did notice that on this one too. I don't think I've got a fuel restriction problem though, so that's why but that's a good tip. Killer Taco 16 writes, the factory 1/4 and 3/4 turns are safe ranges. Stihl allows you to tune the carb via limiter stops. They are not the correct screw sets on the carb. Turn the low up, you're starving it. Turn with 1 to 1.5 turns on the low. You should see extra fuel via blue smoke out the exhaust. I left mine with the Chinese settings the way I got it, and it was a bit rich, but would fire up and run. Turn down the low 1/2 turn and it runs great. So he's basically talking about that he put a Chinesium carburetor on here, and those are some settings he's recommending. And I'm going to talk more about the settings in a bit. D9G Dawn writes, Steve, please go get an NGK spark plug for it. He's referring to the I've been working on this with the Chinesium, where is it? This is the spark plug I just took out. This is the Chinesium spark plug. It's got this weird number. It actually says WX on it. L7T. Anyways, the box it came in was hilarious. So that's a good tip, and I'll address that right now. When I bought this saw, it had an almost new looking NGK BPM R7A plug in it. So I'm going to go back to this plug that was in it because it looks very clean. I'm going to gap the plug, and that's what I'm going to try and run it with. Now this plug, this part number on this plug is the correct part number. I actually checked 2 different sources online, and I even have the online PDF downloaded manual for the saw, which also specs this plug number as the NGK number, the proper plug for this saw. Daniel Hutchinson says the Chinese plug is going to cause you a lot of tuning headaches. Okay, so like I said, NGK. Daniel Hutchinson also followed up and said, after the burb on choke, move up 1 notch, then start. Looks like you started doing that though. So he noticed that. I guess he's concerned that I was keeping it on choke after I got the first, because when I first tried to start the saw, I think for the very first time, if memory serves me, I got 1 burp out of it and then it wouldn't do anything, no matter how many times I pulled it. But I probably kept trying to pull it with the choke on, and I probably flooded the crap out of the plug. I don't think I was getting proper spark. I talked about that in part 6, where I fooled around with some settings in here and then got a hotter spark. And I think I'm going to go back in here and do it again, believe it or not, because I did find in the manual, I did find the specs for the gap. And then he also added a third comment. He said, not that it's an issue right now, but the rubber anti-vibration mount on the chain side at bottom should be flush with white plastic. It will pop in one more notch. Not trying to know it all, Steve. I worked at an Ace Hardware years ago, and Stihl is one of the brands we sold and serviced. Nope, that is not. I appreciate that, actually. So you are not being a know-it-all. You are being helpful. So here's the chain side. Oh, he's talking about this one. I'm thinking this is supposed to come back out further. I'm like, that doesn't seem right. He's talking about this one here sticking out too far, that this should be flush with the white plastic. Okay, that makes more sense. And that's interesting. That would actually... Yeah, you can see there's a gap here. Okay, you can stick this chisel in here. And that gap closes up. It's real tight right here. Because this whole thing's going to shift down when I get this in correctly. There we go. Like that, flush like that. All right, hey. All right. Thank you, Dan. Next one is start at one turn out on both adjustments and tune from there. All right. And so that may very well be a good starting point. I don't know, and I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. Final comment was BPMR7A NGK plug, and yes, I concur. I checked that out. So, and that was the plug that was in the song when I bought it. My friend Roger O'Connor out there in Woodstock, Connecticut says, for $2, I would put a brand new Champion plug in it of the correct heat range. Those wing wang plugs are nothing but garbage. Always start with the simple stuff. Thank you, Roger. Let's see. Keith Pruitt says, great video, man. Thank you. I apologize if you left a comment and I'm not mentioning you. It's just because I'm just trying to get into the meat of the episode here. And the final comment that I'm going to read is Bill G writes, how frustrating. He talks about Donny Boy 73 here on YouTube fixed a similar problem with a new carb. They go for around $20 on Amazon, and I also agree that the colder plug might be part of the problem also. You are so close. Good luck. All right, I'm going to need the luck, maybe. Or maybe not. We'll see. All right, so I'm going to pull the carburetor out and go through the carburetor with a fine-tooth comb. But I wanted to show you guys before I pulled the carburetor out what I noticed here. When I was messing around with this thing, I was playing around with the idle, amongst other things. I had noticed that the idle didn't seem to be, the idle adjustment didn't seem to be working. And the reason why is because the way the idle adjustment works on this particular version of Stihl carburetor is there is actually a cone-shaped point on the end of this screw that goes through this part right here. So it's threaded into here. So as you turn this screws in and out, and it pushes the cone, it pushes that cone in further. And there's a part of the actual throttle lever right here that actually rests on that. So what ends up happening is, as you push the cone in further, that will open up the throttle a little more by pushing down this lever. Well, the reason why I lost all response from this was because I hadn't realized it, but I had turned it in so far that this actually is riding on the threads sticking through. So it's virtually useless at that point. Also, at that position, that throttle butterfly must be cracked open quite a bit, I would think. Yeah, it does look it. So, you guys probably aren't going to be able to see that down there. So, for starters, I know that I had obviously gone too far with this adjustment. It's interesting. It doesn't make much of a change there. I think that that piece is bent. I'm going to get a better look at it when I pull it out. You know, there's quite a bit of gas in that tank right now. I'm going to don some gloves. The missus doesn't appreciate it when I come up to bed in the evening and reek of gas. It's bad enough that I subject her to the smell of my gas, my personal gas, right? All right. All right, so here's that fuel line Scott was talking about. This part right here that he trimmed off a little bit off of this. And so what I was talking about, if you haven't watched it, caught it in the previous episode, was that when this is in here like this, that almost appears to kink this line a little too much. So what Scott's saying is that if I trim just a little bit off of this, that'll allow this to stick on to there further. That'll bring this out just a little bit more, and there'll be less of a kink there. And you know what? That's actually not too bad now that I look at it. The fact that it was running at wide open throttle the way it seemed to be running, I'm not as concerned about fuel starvation due to that kinkage. Kinkage. Did I just say kinkage? So looking from this side, we can really see the throttle butterfly and how the relationship between the position of this screw. If I pull this open, pull it open like this, you can see the end of the screw here is a cone. All right, and it's turned almost all the way in. So what happens is this little piece this little part right here is supposed to be riding on that cone. So as I rotate this out, all right, so that right there is about halfway. I wonder whether or not that's even touching. Yeah, it looks like it is. Boy, that's a real fine adjustment. I guess that's going to be my starting point. Well, I just happened to notice something looking down here. There's a port right here. And it almost looks to me like there's some crud down there. So the next thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about these carb settings, okay? And why I was having some confusion here. All right, the this is the side of the carburetor that faces the air filter. So this is the intake side, okay? So this screw that's on the left is going to be the high-speed screw, and it's marked on here, okay? But the thing to remember is that the low idle mixture screw is going to be the one that's always closest to the cylinder, to the intake. Okay, so that's this one here. So there's two versions of these adjustments here, or these carburetor type these screws. Okay, there's one called the ones with limiter stops, I believe, or limiter plugs. I think they refer to them as limiter plug or plugs, which is what confused me. So, it turns out I initially thought that this was a carburetor that initially had a plug that went in this boss, because you see this aluminum casting, how it sticks out? Well, there's a lot of these models. As a matter of fact, I've got a Stihl carburetor over there from the, it's an old one from the MS190 Stihl. It doesn't have this at all. The screws are just out there naked to the world for everybody to see. So this boss made me think that there was a plug that went in here that they would put in at the factory after they would set this. They would put a plug in there, and it would keep you from being able to stick a screwdriver in there and make the adjustments, which it turns out that was completely wrong. In fact, what the limiter plugs look like, the limiter plugs are little plastic round pieces. There's one that sticks on the end of each one of these screws if it's that type of carburetor. And what the limiter plug does is it limits the range to which you can adjust the screw. So what they do is they set it at the factory. Then they stick the plugs on there so that you can make some adjustment, but you can't mess with the adjustment too much. And I'm imagining that they probably have, the reason why they got to give you some adjustment is so that it can be tuned for different altitudes. Because at different altitudes you're going to have, you're going to need different tunings. So, the idea is that you can pull those plugs, those plastic plugs off. This carburetor clearly never had limiter plugs because there isn't even enough room. With this thing on here, the way it is, there isn't even enough room down here in the well to have two of those limiter plug things in here. On my Stihl trimmer, you can clearly see the plastic plugs that they're talking about. They're almost like little round extension knobs, really. The other way you can tell whether or not the carburetor originally had them was, even if this boss wasn't here, even if this thing sticking out wasn't here and the screws were hanging out in space, if you look at the sides of the heads of the screws, on the screws designed to take the limiter plugs, they have a knurl on the head of the screw, which is what that plastic plug presses onto and keeps it on there and keeps it keyed to it, so that when you turn the plastic plug, because basically the plug actually acts like a big screw head. When you turn that, it turns the screw underneath. Okay. These are smooth, so these are not the limiter plug. And what's interesting about that is that in the manual, they actually discuss the procedure for setting these screws, and there's two separate procedures, one for limiter plug and one for without limiter plug, which I thought was interesting. So just for the heck of it, let's see where we are with these right now. Again, according to this, we're supposed to only have a quarter turn out on low and 3/4 on high. So let's see where we are with high first. High is just over a half a turn. That's where I was with high. Low is supposed to be just a quarter turn. That was a full turn. So I was a full turn out with that. Okay. So that's interesting. The other thing I played around with on this carburetor was, I remembered I took these out, and I think I had determined that there was supposed to be O-rings on these things that actually sealed them. And so I had bought these tiny O-rings to put on there. So I thought about the O-rings, and I was like, well, the O-rings, are they on there to seal this thing? So anyways, so I just took this out, and I noticed as I was turning this that the screw head was going out of round as I turned it, and that's bent. So I don't know how that happened. And I'm not going to dare try and bend it back, because I'll just be asking for it to snap. And you know what? Now that I got this out, son of a gun, those are knurled heads. This did have limiter stops on it. Check it out through the magnifier here. Not sure if that's focusing or not. But see those little knurls on there? Okay, so I got the left-hand screw out, the high-speed one, and I noticed a couple things. There's a little bit of crud on here, which I don't remember being on there. Okay, the O-ring that I talked about is completely out of position on this one. And this screw is also bent a little bit. I am kind of concerned about how that O-ring was out of position on this one. Why the heck was that? Let's see, and that was the high-speed. And all my problems seems to be low speed related. All right, I'm going to leave these two screws out for now. Like I said, I'm going to do a really thorough tear down and cleaning, which I hadn't done yet on this. Oh, that looks pretty darn clean in there. Same with this. See, I'm still thinking that's not supposed to be bent. I don't know if you guys can see that, but that's bent or turns up like that. So the way it is right now, I've got to have that screw right there, this screw backed way out. You see how many threads are showing right there? Before it even starts to really allow this to turn down. I mean, that's about half way up the cone right there. So let me just show you. If I screw this in, and this looks like by design that it's made to go in further because there's actually an indentation, a cone-shaped indentation on the carburetor body right there where this would bottom out. So if I turn this in, all the way, all right, so that's turned in all the way, and the point doesn't quite bottom out on the carburetor body, but the point is that now, because the way this is bent, this is actually hitting the threads. So I think I need to straighten that out just a little bit. So I'm going to get some needle nose and I'm going to carefully bend that. I think that should be almost a right angle right in here. I think this is supposed to be a right angle, and it's not. This is actually bent. This is bent downward. All right, that's a little bit better. Didn't make much of a difference, but then again, cracking that open just a tiny bit might make all the difference in the world when this thing's running. All right, back to the bigger kettle of fish. Let's move along now, and let's take off this cover here. Okay, so this is not great. What we've got here is, this is not ripped, but I don't know if you can see this. There's a deformity here. Okay. I don't know how big of a deal that's going to be. Now, in the service manual, it actually talks about one of the things that can happen is this spring can get out of position when you're reassembling this and cause a problem. So I was just double checking when I put this back together whether or not that spring is in the correct position, and it is. The other thing that you can check is you can actually check the height, I believe, of this lever right here in reference to the carburetor body. I think it's supposed to be flush with that. If you take a straight edge and go across the top of the carburetor body and bring it across, that should be, it might be a little low. Well, this is all looking pretty clean. That's clean. Well, let's see. I could either stay down here and clean this, finish it up tonight, or I could go up and have a big bowl of ice cream in the morning. Hey, you know what? I was thinking about this whole carburetor deal here, how this is held on. It slides over these two studs, and then when you screw on this air filter, it pushes on that, and I thought maybe that's how this actually got held on. But then I thought maybe I remembered there being a nut that was on here. So I had to go back and actually look at my original videos when I took this apart. And what I discovered when I originally took this apart was that there was one 5mm nut, an M58 nut that was on one of these studs. And then I remembered, I saw my own remarks. I remarked about the fact that, oh yeah, you can see that there's recesses on the back of this for those nuts to stick into. And there's two recesses. So that made me think, So first thing I did was I looked around, and sure enough, I did have a orphaned 5mm nut sitting here on the workbench. So you can bet that was the one I took off when I originally took this apart. So then I went online and I found the parts diagram. And in the parts diagram, because of the way the exploded view looks, you can't see like both studs, but you could see one nut. But when you look at the parts list, it says the part number for the nut, and it says it's an M5-8 nut, and it says quantity 2. So that made me realize that originally from the factory there's supposed to be 2 of these nuts on here, one on each side, which makes perfect sense. But I did not have any more M5-8 nuts. This only came to me with 1 nut. So somebody had lost the other one at some point. So I went to the store and I picked up 2 nuts. I actually only needed 1, but unfortunately the Chinese-made fasteners at Home Depot, this small, are only sold in 2-packs, so I had to spend a whole 43 cents. So I'm going to take one of these out of the package and put it on this side before I put it all back together. And those nuts help keep this carburetor tight up and help increase the sealing effort against that little manifold or rubber boot. Alright, so I put those nuts on, tighten the carburetor up. I gapped the spark plug and put that NGK spark plug in. And the last thing I'm going to do before I try and start it again is I'm going to reset the gap again on this ignition module. I've already loosened the module up. I did find in the manual the specs, and the gap is supposed to be set between 0.15 millimeter, which is just a hair under 6 thousandths, and 0.30 millimeter, which I believe is about 11 thousandths. So let's see, 6, 11. So I think I'm going to go with 8 thousandths. And again, there's a special tool that Stihl has for doing this job. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to find just some shim stock that is the correct size and use that. Well, nothing left to do now except go out and try it. Wish me luck. Alright, so I'm going to try choke on, and then if it sputters, I'll turn the choke off and see what happens. improvement. It still ain't right though. Still not right. So where I'm at right now with this low speed idle screw is that if I back it out any further, the RPMs start to go up too high, and I've pretty much got the idle adjustment, the idle screw, meaning the little stop, the little screw that has the point on it that opens up the butterfly. I've got that pretty much out to the point where it's really not going to do anything anymore. So I can't back out that low speed idle screw without the RPMs being too high. If I had it in the quarter turn or even the half turn that it's on here it says to do, it won't even run. With it in the position I have it now, I can actually get it to restart. The idle tends to creep up and down. It seems almost like the carburetor is loading up, and every once in a while it seems to starve for fuel and die. So I'm still not quite sure what's going on there. But for the first time since I've been dealing with this thing in a long time, I'm actually able to restart it with it not on choke. And again, that's because now I have this backed out pretty far. So I'm going to just rotate this in just to see how far out I actually have it. So I just turned it in till it bottomed out to see how far I've turned it out. I've got this thing out over 1 full turn now. It's almost at 1 1/4. It's about 1 1/8. Alright, I just went in and read the service manual again, and alright, I forgot that I had seen this before in the manual, that these initial settings right here on this shroud of a 1/4 turn out for the low and 3/4 of a turn out for the high are for carburetors with limiter stops on them, on the screws. Now, as we recall from before, when I looked at these screws, judging from the fact that it's got those little ribs on the end of the screw, this carburetor had limiter caps on it, and somebody removed them. So, since I've got no limiter caps on there, I can't go by this setting, because this 1/4 turn out would be if I turned it all the way in to the stop of the limiter cap, and then I come out a 1/4 turn from that point, but I don't know where that point was. So I have to treat this as if it doesn't have limiter caps. And the manual says when you don't have a tachometer and you want initial settings, that you should set the high speed 1 turn out. And it also stresses that if you do not have a tachometer, that you should not mess with that adjustment, because the high speed screw will regulate the max RPMs, and if you don't have a tachometer and you set that too high, it could be way too lean, or is it too rich, I forget which, on the high speed, and you could, I don't know, melt the piston. So that's 1 full turn out. So there's my initial starting points. See if we'll start with the choke off. It's still still warm. Nope. Won't stay running. Okay. So let's see if I turn this throttle in, this LA adjustment.
So I've got it adjusted to a point now where it seems to be idling okay and restarting okay. Doesn't seem to be stalling as much, but when I goose the throttle, it starves for fuel and dies. It's bogging. Too dark for me to be able to see those screws easily. So I'm going to quit tonight. But I'm at a point now where if I adjust that low mixture screw so that I can get it to idle well, then it dies when I give it throttle. That seems to be where it seems to idle the best and start the easiest in that position, but then it won't. It'll just it'll stall or bog really badly if I give it throttle. And if I adjust that mixture screw so that I can get it to not stall when I give it throttle, then I can't get the RPMs down to idle, and either that or it just won't idle at all. So I'm still thinking we might have a carburetor issue here. Could be the diaphragm or the metering, the membrane that does the metering. It could be that. Don't know. Oh well. That's it for tonight. The Stihl MS290 chainsaw. Take two.